When everything feels urgent, nothing feels understandable. You scroll, you read, you listen, and somehow you're more confused than when you started. You're not uninformed. You're overexposed to narratives without context, conflict without clarity, and conversations designed to make you choose a side before you even understand the issue. This show isn't about telling you what to think. It's about slowing down the noise just long enough to ask better questions. I'm Quiver-Arnold, and this is Context, Not Chaos. Last episode, we talked about why everything feels so confusing right now, and how that confusion isn't a personal failure, but a structural one. Today, we're going to zoom in on one of the most powerful and least examined forces shaping how we understand the world: language. Not just what's being said, but how it's being said, which words are chosen, and what those words quietly ask us to assume before we even finish the sentence. Because before we ever form opinions about political or social issues, we're already being guided, sometimes gently, sometimes aggressively, by the language surrounding them. Let's slow this down. Here's a common myth about communication: that words are just labels for reality. But in practice, words don't just describe events, they interpret them. Think about the differences between protest and riot, or illegal and undocumented, or even security measure and restricted, right? Each pair refers to a similar action or condition, but signals a completely different moral framework. And most of the time, we don't consciously notice that shift. We absorb it. That's because language works fastest when it feels familiar, and most dangerous when it feels inevitable. In media and public discourse, some would say, this is called framing. Now, a frame doesn't tell you what to think. It tells you what kind of thinking is appropriate. For example, if an issue is framed as a threat, fear or anxiety become reasonable. If it's framed as a failure, blame oftentimes becomes necessary. But if it's framed as a cultural war, well, compromise almost feels like weakness. Frames narrow the range of acceptable responses before we even realize we've agreed to them. And here's where confusion enters the picture, right? When different outlets use different frames for the same event, people aren't just disagreeing on conclusions, they're operating from entirely different realities. But that's not stupidity, that's communication architecture. From a social science perspective, certain kinds of language spread faster than others, right? Words that activate identity or signal belonging, these imply moral urgency. And these words do something important. They tell us who we're supposed to be in relation to the issue. Are you a defender, a victim, an ally, or a threat? Once language assigns a role, people tend to protect that role, even when new information complicates it. That's why debates often feel impossible, because you're not arguing facts, but what you're really doing is negotiating identities. Now, this doesn't stay in the abstract. It shows up at dinner tables, in group chats, or even in friendships that suddenly feel fragile. When issues are framed as moral absolutes, disagreement stops feeling like difference and starts feeling like danger. And people respond to perceived danger in some pretty predictable ways, right? We get defensive, we have withdrawal, oftentimes we feel overwhelmed, or we get aggressive, or just get silent. But none of these lead to understanding. They only lead to distance. If we want healthier public discourse, we have to start noticing when language is quietly turning people into symbols instead of humans. Here's a simple practice you can try this week. When you hear or read a story that triggers a strong reaction, I want you to pause and swap one word. Ask yourself, what happens if I replace this loaded term with a more neutral one, right? Thinking back to our example, illegal versus undocumented. Does the story change, or does my emotional response shift? This isn't about sanitizing reality. I want you to get that out of your head. But really, it's about reclaiming your ability to think clearly before reacting, because awareness creates space. Before you log off, let's take one moment to bring this back to the human scale. Not the headline, not the algorithm, not the argument you're already rehearsing in your head. Just one question to carry with you. Today's question is this: what words around this issue feel non-negotiable, and who benefits from that rigidity? I want you to notice where language closes doors instead of opening understanding. You don't need to answer in this moment. Just be aware. Because when we learn to hear language more carefully, we start listening to each other differently too. I'm Quiver-Arnold. This has been Context, Not Chaos, and we'll pick this back up next time.